my goodness, we're back. We're back at CYTO in person. And what that really makes me think about is really returning to my favorite movie, Back to the Future. Which did get some things right. Notably, in 2015, it predicted that the Cubs would sweep the series in 5. It took them just, a little bit longer than that. It took them until 2016 after 108 building years, but pretty prescient from Back to the Future. The other thing that I think it was incredibly prescient about, in 2015, you see here it predicting the antagonist Douglas Needles, being annoying on video chat, and that's something that's obviously persisted through to today, and luckily, and quite presciently predicting how Zoom has really ruled our lives the past 2 years. But now that we're back at CYTO, we can now get back to the work of talking about the future, and something that I'm obviously very passionate about, and thinking about what do the future of all these fields mean, given the progress that we've made, given some of the technology, and as we'll discuss, given some of the pressures now that some of this technology puts on other parts of the workflow. So today we'll talk about what's the future of single cell, spatial, and flow, putting it in the context of, what are some predictions that I've made in the past, and what's come to pass. And so I've got a little bit of credibility in this. I have ridden in a DeLorean, and so I feel like I've got some of the ability to now get us back to the future. So we're going to start with single cell sequencing and the workflows there. And again, putting single cell sequencing in context, way back in 2016, we partnered, when I was running Flowjo, we partnered with Illumina. And at that time, people asked me, Illumina? And it was quite out of the ordinary at that time. And, so we were talking about single cell RNA-seq analysis many years ago, and the pressure that this would put on the field, given the size of this data, looking at, many thousands of genes expressed across many thousands of cells. And we also talked about sequence tagged antibodies at that time, well ahead of even their commercial launch. Prateep and I had the opportunity to present the single cell workshop in 2017. Again, really quite far ahead of when these 10x Chromium boxes really ended up in the cores right after cell prep and cell sorting. And even back then, we were actually talking about one of the primary concerns that came up in this conference, which was the notion of cell viability and how that's hugely impactful to results. And now you really at the end of 2020, it's 300 plus human monoclonal antibody specificities for sequence tagged antibodies alone, and many hundreds for mouse as well. And so, where does that put us with single cell? And in single cell in 2022 is a bit of a different story. We really see the rise of what I'm referring to here quite unashamedly as single cell mousetraps, where every technology, be it physical separation or physical separation in the context of reagents using either microfluidics or microwells or, barcoding approaches, is all in summary really advancing, if you will, particularly the cost part of the equation, Moore's law in single cell sequencing. And I think, I remember back, when the 10x Chromium first came out, someone said, really, I was visiting a biotech company, and they said, we really wish that these would work in higher throughput. And so what they did is they just bought 10x Chromiums. And so now, we're entering the era where we've got a lot of these solutions. Cost is going way down, throughput's going up. And really the sum total of this, in my view, is really that it'll just push on 10x, the dominant player in the market, to really come out with just a lower cost, higher throughput instrument. So we're seeing a lot of these, and this is just 3 of many that I've seen in the field. And again, when we think about this and we think about what the market is really demanding now, we've been in a world where we've been able to look at what I refer to as single cell potentiality for a while. We can say, hey, look, here's this gene that this cell is expressing. It might end up expressing it at some point, for instance, something like an IL-2 gene or an interferon gamma gene. But when I talk to people who are, in antibody production or they're in cell therapy, what they really want to know is single cell reality. They want to know, what is a cell really doing, and is it producing these cytokines? Particularly, is a particular cell doing that? And so the technology I'll highlight today for you to check out would be the folks at Partillion Bioscience, who are able to encapsulate single cells within these nanovial containers and then actually assay those cells. So actually assay the antibodies that they're secreting or the cytokines that they're secreting. And I think it's a really innovative approach to be able to look at single cell reality and single cell function and really move us beyond potentiality where, I think, again, we're going to be in this world of low cost and high throughput, but move us into single cell reality, which I think is really important. And, the other important part actually about this technology is that it requires no new hardware, right? You can run it on a flow cytometer. And I think this follows really the reagent innovation, epic that we've really been seeing, since 2020. And so I think technologies like this that can assay single cell function are really going to be where a lot of our interest and a lot of movement goes to. The second field to cover is spatial omics. And the story of spatial omics to me equally is interesting and fun. And, Nikolai Samusik came into my office in 2014 and said, "Hey, I'm working on this thing." And he diagrammed something actually on my conference table and said, "It's this thing, and I'm not so sure. But we're going to give it a go." And that ended up actually becoming Akoya, which IPO'd relatively recently. And we see a lot of movement now in spatial genomics. 10x has acquired Spatial Genomics in 2018. The NanoString GeoMX launch was in 2019. It was Nature's Method of the Year in 2020. We see the expansion of this within CYTO sequencing, where 10x bought both Recore and Cortana and merged those platforms to come out with the Xenium platform this year. And now there's really quite a large number of companies that are going after this spatial space. And I think to that end, I really think, and again, somewhat unashamedly, that spatial and the number of platforms that are there have really become quite like real estate. They're real world analog where, in the United States, for instance, there's 1.04 million homes, but 1.45 million realtors. And so we have a lot of different choices with respect to the spatial platforms that we can choose. And I think if you kind of look at, well, what's the real issue with having this many spatial platforms, and even looking at the way that we do even standard H&E staining or FFPE or any of these other tissue preparations, is that they're still incredibly manual, right? We're still paying scientists quite a bit of money to move liquid around. They're not automated, and there's a high amount of variability with all these different protocols. And so I actually partnered with Nikolai to fund his next effort here, which is Parhelia Bio, where you can actually automate the staining of these slides or these tissue preparations. Incredibly flexible in terms of the number of applications that you can do, but really addresses a reproducibility and also volume of reagent issue when you get into staining slides. And so I think it's going to be some of these more, if you think prosaic or more boring aspects actually in the field, something that we'll talk quite a bit about when we talk about flow cytometry. That's actually where a huge need in innovation is. It's not that we need another spatial platform, right? We have tons of choices there, but what we do need is the ability to get very reproducible staining. And then, of course, my and your first love is, flow cytometry. So how do we think about flow cytometry, both in terms of what's come before and then also what comes next? And so I think first, I have to take some guilt on for potentially, at least coining or maybe accelerating the usage of this term full spectrum cytometry. This is something that I was talking about back in 2016 in Seattle, and really saying, look, spectral is coming. And now it's obviously very much here, but we had talked about spectral deconvolution and the implications on instruments, reagents, and software as far back as 2016. And then, in 2017, really into the beginning of 2020, I was incredibly concerned and shared that concern that we had approached the Floor asymptote. In other words, we were not producing, Roederer's law, where the number of fluorophores, doubles, every 2 years. And, really with the stall, particularly when we saw what was projected, at least for the brilliant blues, and that really never manifested itself in the late 20-teens, that we were really at the limit of the fluorophore development. And so this was obviously concerning enough to me in 2019 and 2020 that I took a role at Photonics, where we released 19 different fluorophores in 6 months there, and really accelerated the development of fluorophores, and really continued on this reagent innovation epic, and bringing us back to the pace that we need to see in both fluorophore quality and then also the number of colors that we have, to assay single cells in flow. When I think about flow cytometry in 2022 and beyond, though, I actually think that it's the ends of the workflow, both the beginning of the workflow, controls, and then the end of the workflow, where there's a huge amount of pressure now. And so we'll talk about that now. And so just diagrammed very simply here, where I see huge needs for innovation, and then highlighting some companies that are doing some great work in each of these fields. And so the first one is in sample prep. And, so this is one where, gosh, we've increased the throughput of our instruments, we've increased the plex of our instruments, but sample prep has really lagged incredibly behind. One company addressing this is Curiox. They've got a laminar flow system for cell prep. Really does not yet address cell staining. There's still an enormous opportunity space for cell prep and for cell staining, and automating that process. Again, this notion that we are, having scientists move liquid around and not moving them really into the more, not having them focus in on the knowledge aspects of these workflows, to me is still incredibly frustrating. And still, when we used to come to these meetings, we would say, gosh, the largest bit of variability is in the data analysis. And it seems like over time, we've really been able to address that issue. And now we all know that the biggest issues in variability are really down to sample prep. The second aspect of the flow cytometry workflow, and indeed single cell and spatial would be included in this, is controls. And this is still, I'd say, a very wide open area. There's one company that's creating synthetic cells as controls in this field, Slingshot. I'd really highlight some of their work, really pioneering this notion of cell mimic controls. There's still a huge open lane here for synthetic cells or live cell mimics, that can be run with every experiment to control, for what's going on. And all of us that have had the pain of using, strect controls to the like in every single experiment, would really like something that's a lot more consistent that we can count on, and that we can just quite literally grab, out of a vial that's fit for purpose, fit for our cell types. The third part of this is, there's not very far to go in hardware, right? And so if we take a step back, before we get into some of the announcements from CYTO, all we have left is the near IR, really, because we've got IR lasers on some of our instruments already, probably, accelerated by, at least on the detection side, by some of these new gas PMTs, which have great performance. And then, in the purple, we've got deep UV, but that's it. I mean, we're not, unless we start using, radio waves or other forms of radiation, which we're not going to do in flow cytometry. We've really reached the ends of the spectrum. We have really nowhere else to go. And, we've been talking about fluorescence lifetime for several decades. I don't see that entering mainstream use anytime soon. And, it's been kind of hanging around the hoop there for quite literally decades. So I can't see that coming to pass. And so, we look at this past year in the hardware game, we've got announcements, like bright field imagery, vis-a-vis the CyPix, or now we're taking, images of cells off the blue laser with BD's new system. So, that's fine. That's where some of the hardware innovation is. But to me, that puts just increased pressure on all parts of the workflow that aren't hardware. If you think that your sample prep or your controls, are sufficient now, just wait till you can see inside the cell and, things aren't translocating, or you don't have a control, that shows you that part of the protocol was done correctly. So I see that hardware creating more trickle down effects. But to be honest, I don't see really a huge need for more innovation on the hardware side. We really are approaching the margins here in terms of where we can innovate anymore. The final bit of this, of course, is one that I've been passionate about for a very long time, which is analysis, and something that I have a need for and see a continued need in the field for, and rising need in the field as these experiments grow in size and complexity is this need for an algorithm workflow as an app, right? Where you can take any, either public or private algorithm, turn that into an app, and then also have the ability to have reporting wrapped around that, and also have full data provenance, really, if you think about it, from cradle to grave. And that's why I've had the pleasure of working with Tercen, over the past year and a half. And so this follows along with this other obsession that I've had, which is the actually using human cognition in the context of data analysis. And what do I mean by that? What we're able to do, if you're looking for a system where you can get the most out of both the human and the computer, is you want to be able to offload cognition on perception. And that means that instead of having to do complex computations, you can actually do that looking at simple pattern recognition, seeing a similar cluster, right, appearing across multiple different samples, for instance. This is also critically important because it also raises the importance of summary visualizations, where you can actually see emergent features. These are areas where the human brain is doing very complex computation, but it's also where a huge amount of the value in having a human, if you will, in the loop and looking at all this data. This is where the value comes in. It's not in the, it's not in the cleanup gates, and it's not in, adjusting that or looking at the compensation. This is where the real value comes, because this is where discovery lives, is in seeing these emergent features. The second aspect of this that's equally as important is then how do you accelerate that? And the answer is you use actions, right? And those actions or those external manipulations of the data, they need to be focused for maximum insight. And so, Tercen enables an environment where you actually have this very tactile grasp on your factors, the different variables in your experiment, and you can actually use those actions then to generate insight. We all have had this fantasy where we want to manipulate our data, just like Tom Cruise did, in Minority Report. And now really, we're at that junction where we can actually do that and really think about human cognition in the context of data analysis. And to the point, Tercen takes both algorithms and the entire workflow that contain these as apps. And the game-changing part of this, of course, is that when you publish a paper or when you share your insight, now you can share the entire chain of analysis and also the raw data that comes with it. And that notion of not just leveraging very complicated or very sophisticated bioinformatic algorithms, but also being able to wrap this all together as one unit, to me, really changes the game in data analysis. And so that's why I've partnered with Tercen. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ferris.